All right. Well, welcome everyone. Welcome. We are so excited to have you here tonight. It is events like this that makes me so happy to be part of the Women's Leadership Council. I get to meet amazing women who are speaking tonight and just be part and learn from them. So I'm really excited about this event. So the Women's Leadership Council is proud to host the second in our series, Breaking the Silence, Amplifying Our Voices, with 3 generations of Trinity women who will share their experiences and insight into the topic of women and leadership. And we'll discuss the role Trinity played in developing and shaping their leadership skills. I encourage all of you that after this event, you will get an email about a survey. Please share your feedback about this event and what other events you would like to see from the Women's Leadership Council. Also, our next Women Leadership Council event is May 4th and is called Trust in the Media with Amy Katz, Charity Elder, Sarah Cody, and Helen Ubiñas. All right. I hope all of you had the opportunity to read the email with our amazing speakers' bios. So I will not take up time tonight. But with that, I would like to just thank our speakers tonight and just welcome them tonight. So with us tonight, we have Terrie Rouse-Rosario, class of 74, Yarel Silverio Marshall, class of 96, and Taniqua Huguley, class of 2015, master's 2017. With that, I'll turn it over to Taniqua.
Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Taniqua Huguley. As Shakira said, today I have the great opportunity to interview and have a good conversation alongside Yarel as we talk to Miss Terrie Rouse-Rosario. And so we're going to hop right in. As Shakira said, hopefully you took a look at our bios. If not, you'll definitely find out about Miss Terrie during this conversation. So I'm going to hop right in. So Miss Terrie, and I'm going to call you Miss Terrie because I just can't call you just by your first name, Terrie. That's just respecting.
That's fine. I love it.
My mom wouldn't like that. So Miss Terrie, we're going to talk a little bit about your experience, right? And when I say your experience, I'm talking about your experience as a Black woman. I told you we're hopping right in. So how has your experience as a Black woman shaped your experience in leadership?
You know, that's first of all, I'm so glad to be talking to you, young women, this evening. This is the best inspiration I've had in a while. And how's being a Black woman shaped my role of leadership? You know, it shaped it because, you know, as a Black woman in the period that I started at Trinity in 1970, you had to sort of have a sense of oneself. And you had to be ready for that moment that as a pioneer, as somebody who was sent off to school to do something different, you didn't always have somebody to rely on. So there had to have been that moment inside of you when you said, you know, I'm gonna make this happen. And I see that so much with African-American women, you know, Black and brown women, and women in general often, that you're there by yourself and you say, I'm gonna make this happen. So it shaped it. Now that leadership quality that you acquire in those environments is what helped me as I became a president, a CEO, executive director, a manager of things, because you have to have that sense of self that allows you to propel forward. Whatever style of management you're doing at that time, you do have to have a sense of self. And that allows you to say, okay, we're gonna push through this, or accept the failure, accept the success. So that's sort of how it helped me.
So moving on with that and thinking about your biography, which I again remind everyone, if you've had a chance to read it, a reminder of how impressive it is. And if you haven't, I encourage you to look back at the emails that was sent, because you've had a long history. And it's a very interesting one to tell. But would you start by sharing how you arrived at Trinity, especially during a time when Trinity was making a concerted effort to increase their African-American population, as well as recently admitting women, which was 1974 or somewhere around that time period, yes?
Well, actually, the first class was 1969. I was the entering class in 1970. So it was almost 50 years ago. Well, it was 50 years ago. So, Yarel, this is a great question. I've had a chance to think about it a little bit. I had the advantage, if you will, of my father being a World War II veteran. And somewhere when I was about 12 or 13, he went from working at one place, he would work for the Armory there in Youngstown, Ohio, which is where I was born. And we had a chance to do what civilians do when they're attached to the Army. We started moving around. So that first move at 12 or 13, when you're like, oh my God, I'm leaving my friends, and you end up someplace else, teaches an important lesson. Oh, first of all, I can be somewhere else. And two, I can make new friends, or I can navigate that world, and I can take everything that I learned from my hometown, learn some new things, and manage it. And then in my case, I went from Columbus, Ohio to Baltimore, which is where I ultimately graduated. And in Baltimore is where I was recruited, or if you want to put it that way, someone came to my high school, Forest Park High School, and talked about Trinity in 1969. And he was a young African-American young man who graduated. I can't for the life of me remember his name, but I remember standing there looking at him somewhere in an office, being absolutely amazed. And he talked about the experience of being at Trinity. And of course, these were all male classes. And it just sounded amazing to me. It sounded like a great opportunity. If my parents had had my way, I would have gone to school in Maryland. But when I was accepted, it's something I wanted to do, and there I was. So it was important. The most important thing I then took with me when I went to Trinity was that experience of being adaptable. You arrive on the campus and suddenly, oh, well, I don't know any of these people. And one of the first people I met is someone who became my roommate, who was Elizabeth Ross from Detroit. And we were walking down the long walk that she reminded me a few weeks ago of this. So you meet people who you had common experience with, and then at the same time, you started meeting other people. So that's what it was. That's what brought me to Trinity, that recruitment. Now, the clincher with all that was I was the second class of women entering in 1970. There were 7 African-American women in my class. And at that time at Trinity, they were still negotiating as to whether or not women should be at Trinity. Go look back at Trinity reporters from that time. The whole issue of having, women's products in the gift shop was a whole debate period. And there were still young men in your classes that did not want women there. So it was an entirely different sort of experience, but it was one that, I embraced, and here I am.
I think it's a great demonstration of intersectionality during a time when that word really wasn't used or existed, wasn't coined at the time. And there's much I can relate to what you're saying, Terrie, in not thinking about a location and then seeing an opportunity. For me, it was actually my guidance counselor letting me know that there was a weekend for students of color. So it was a good opportunity for me to check out college life, not necessarily that I would attend that school. And it was a no pressure kind of way. And I fell in love with the campus. I fell in love with how welcomed I felt. And I got to practice how to have an interview. And I think knowing that it was a trial experience, maybe I was less, nervous about the interview. But for me, I am the first to be born in this country. So being of an immigrant family, looking back, I realized how progressive my parents were, especially being Latino, in that they allowed me to get on a bus and go from Lawrence, Massachusetts to Hartford, Connecticut on my own, for them to pick me up and have this amazing weekend and come back and say, I would love it if I could go to this school. And it worked out, no regrets. But by then, I feel like there was a bigger mix in terms of men and women. As a matter of fact, at least in terms of students of color, there were more women than men. And the sense of welcome that I received both from the incoming freshmen along with me, as well as the upperclassmen, is an experience that I've never forgotten. How about you, Taniqua?
Yeah, it's interesting that both of you kind of talked about your first time stepping foot on campus before you were a student and right when you were a student. So I came to Trinity my senior year of high school with the Posse Foundation because I'm a Posse scholar. And so we came for a weekend and we had the chance to kind of get a taste of what Trinity was like. And I remember that I had the opportunity to go to, I think this happened on a Friday night, and it was WAGRAC. Laura Lockwood, who we all work with closely, was hosting Take Back the Night. And if anyone knows anything about Take Back the Night, that event is to truly address sexual assault. And some people may say, whoa, that didn't scare you away. But no, it showed me the student leaders on campus, and it also showed me the great steps that Trinity was taking to address some issues on campus, but also throughout the nation. And there were just so many student leaders there where I said, wow, like there's standing up, standing on stage and speaking aloud and gathering people from campus to address one issue that everyone cared about. And so that kind of was like a spark to me. That was my first site of leadership on Trinity's campus. And so you just talked about, Ms. Terrie, you talked a little bit about, being a part of the second class of women. And I think each of us come from different generations of Trinity women, but I think yours might be the most remarkable. And I say that because you all set the tone for, the journey of so many other Black women that came after you, even myself and even the current students there. And so during your time at Trinity, I know working with you the past few months, you made sure Black students weren't silenced. I know that you participated in events and organizations, and you truly created opportunities that allow Black students to voice their opinions and concerns. And you do that as an alum as well. So what inspired you and what inspires you to speak out and to use your voice?
It's a great question. I think a couple things inspired me. I had the advantage of coming from a family where my father used to always remind me that the women in the family had their own baseball team. This is in Youngstown, Ohio. And he kept saying that. And then I realized what he was talking about, where these were women who had their own sense of agency. There's no notion of, wow, you do what you want to do. You make a statement, you wear red. I remember having a whole discussion with my father in the 60s about wearing red. And I realized it was about empowerment. And so when we came to Trinity in 1970, as a young people, having seen Martin Luther King killed, Malcolm X killed, Angela Davis, the Black Panthers, it's 1970, and we're there. And that sense of having to have a voice was important. So the students, we would come together and have a voice. And that was also a time when women were sort of taught, you kind of take a back step, let the men do it. And, we kind of ruffled our feathers a little bit about that, but it was the idea that we had to have a voice, something to say. And Trinity embraced that notion. I remember sitting in on interview for Jim Miller when he became one of the first Black professors at Trinity. I remember going to what is Ujamaa House now, when it was first opened and first acquired and the students came in. So it was this interesting balance of Trinity trying to create a sense of purpose for all of us, reflecting the times, and then all of us trying to find our own voice as young people, because young people, we all had a different view of the world. There were the urban kids, and there were the country kids, and there were the sophisticated kids, and there was a different world there. Everybody was different, and that was okay, because we all were there for a reason, to make a difference in our own lives and other lives. So that's sort of the way it was. Some of the excitement, though, was watching, the different personalities, and I learned how to play bid whist. So that was an important part of my upbringing at that age of, 18. What about you? How did you enjoy your times?
Well, for me, I graduated from Trinity in 2015. Actually, I'm in my office. As you can see, I do have Bantam pride. So I had a good time at Trinity. And so I came to Trinity in 2011 from Long Island City, Queens, New York, and only 2 hours away, but I had never spent time in Connecticut before. Believe it or not, I didn't even know about Trinity until my junior year of high school. I was a part of an organization called Legal Outreach, which is it's a college-bound program located in New York City, and with a legal focus. But we had quite a few legal outreach alum that attended Trinity over the years, and I didn't know much about small private schools or liberal arts schools until I participated in legal outreach. And so after doing my research and then also being afforded a full tuition grant from Posse, I came to Trinity. And so it was the money that brought me, but it was the experiences that kept me. And so at Trinity, I was involved in a ton of things, Trinity College Black Women's Organization, alumni relations, the Emoja House as a cultural house coordinator. I became a member of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated, and I did a ton of things in the city. And my experience was just truly shaped by what it meant to be a Black student at Trinity at that time, right? And how we supported one another and served as a family to ensure that we all got through, because it wasn't the best place for everyone. But for me, I think I truly took advantage of my time on campus academically and socially, which shaped who I am today. Both a positive and negative. But I am definitely a Bantam supporter. I have mentees at Trinity, and I try to stay involved as much as possible. But it's those experiences, such as making sure that our voices are heard, that really made a mark on my Trinity experience, because Trinity provided the platform for students to voice their concerns and their opinions, and that was something that I was blown away by.
Yarel, what about you?
Well, I think for me, it was more, I learned at Trinity how to have a voice. Again, coming from an immigrant family, I was actually rather sheltered, and I wasn't allowed to do many things. I came from an all-girls high school, parochial school, very much felt like a minority. And I didn't realize till many years later that because I was in two dual language cultural atmosphere, there was a lot that I still didn't understand. I didn't understand what certain things meant. I had never participated in activism or exposed. I also was learning or being introduced to my identity and what it meant to be Dominican. I will never forget one of my friends saying, "You keep saying you're Dominican. Do you think that you're better than us?" And I was so confused because, I came from an area that's how you identified. And meanwhile, again, I came from a predominantly white private school. We were always the minority. And here at Trinity, for me, was a very diverse group. And who accepted me was the Black community. And within the Black community, I got a chance to be very active and watch and learn how to be a woman, how to identify as a Black woman, even though I couldn't articulate that at the time, but I know that that was a lot of my foundation in my current identity, and learning to use the collaborating and coming together. It was a confusing time, but it was because I was learning and I was willing to grow. And like Taniqua, I was involved in everything between sports and 5 jobs and this committee and so on. But because I loved every opportunity that was there, and I was hungry to learn and to be a part of it. And I think that I came across as knowing more because I was articulate. But but that didn't necessarily translate to comprehension. So it was, I want to say that it was my true foundation to where I am now. So to continue with that, how do you think that Trinity prepared you for your career or your postgraduate life, or did it?
Again, an excellent question. You know, I reflected on this quite a bit because I had a chance to have some opportunities when I was at Trinity. Between my junior and senior year, I went to Africa for 2 months. And because I was an intercultural studies major, so I had a real interest in the continent of Africa and in economics. And I got a chance to go to Ghana and spend 2 months, and I ended up writing a paper. I might add, a rather bad paper, but I wrote a paper on market women in Ghana. And it became that moment when I said, you know, I learned about, because I've written a lot about women artists, women in the economy, and that sort of thing. It gave me a chance to see that to see that moment of, these are women who were in charge. And they were in charge of a market. They didn't have to shout that. It was just who they were. So that experience and the other things that I did on campus taught me that sometimes there's this strength in silence, and then sometimes there's this strength in a voice, but it's always strength. It's about how you walk into a room. I learned that from that experience that summer. I learned that I think I was at we organized our first Trinity Black Women's Organization meeting, an informal meeting, like my junior year or my senior year. So you learn the power of women gathering and women being engaged. And everybody doesn't have to be the same. We just have a commonality in this particular area. I used that skill as I went on to graduate school, to doing organizing work. And of course, I use it a lot in the arts world and in arts administration. The fine art of learning to listen and then take action, and learning how to be convincing with what you have learned. And I think I learned that summer between my junior and senior year, watching the women in the market and watching the women doing other things. It taught me some of that power. So that's what I take away from it as I reflect back. But I don't know, Taniqua, what about you? You got a little shorter experience here in the leadership world.
Yes. So yeah, but very short experience, but I think even my first year at Trinity, it kind of, it shaped, it's shown throughout my short career, but also the rest of my undergrad years. And so very similar to you, and something that Yarel said was just finding the power and kind of like discovering myself as a Black woman. We know that Trinity is a predominantly white school, meaning that most of our courses are, most of my courses were with people who did not look like me. Better yet, probably didn't come from the same neighborhood that I came from, or the same type of neighborhood that I came from. So I literally learned how to navigate white spaces. Today, I am an outreach director for an organization that focuses on housing policy. We focus on desegregating the state. And it's not a friendly space to be sometimes, right? Especially when you talk about housing and property values and taxes and racism. Those are just words that people are not keen to, especially when it comes out of the mouth of a young Black woman. And so many times people think that I am the intern and, or who is the person that I'm meeting with, those type of experiences. But truly being able to speak up for myself and learn how to navigate spaces such as Trinity is what helped me get as far as I have today. And I think also just the experience of learning myself and learning my culture. It wasn't until I came to Trinity and took sociology courses that I truly started to learn Black history and learn more about Black feminism and, society, how society is shaping the lives of of people of color, which is why I do some of the work that I do now. My entire Trinity experience has definitely kind of paved the way for all the work that I'm doing. Yarel, I'm interested to hear a little bit about your story to see if you have any similar experiences.
I'll admit that mine was, I think, a little slower than both of you, because I married my college sweetheart, and we were figuring things out together. My intention was to let him go to school first, and I would follow, especially because, and I guess this is where Trinity gave me, as well as my being in an all-girls school prior to, but the confidence that I could do whatever. I was versatile. I did not feel like I was tied to anything in general. But a couple of years later, we started, our family started to grow. Had my son, my husband, Carl, class of 96 also, was in the military. So we started moving around. Then I had 2 small children. And I'll be honest, I felt that I was doing my education a poor service. I felt a bit ashamed or inadequate, because I feel that Trinity prepares you for success. And I didn't feel successful because I was home with 2 small children, and we were a single income family, which meant, we were really starting from the bottom. And my peers were continuing on to grad school and were becoming professional and so on. So I think I was a late bloomer in understanding that all of my experiences put me in a position to do all the things that I've done, which is to be a mother and educate my kids the way I wanted them to be educated, hence why I stayed home, as hard as that was, to be a support to Carl, because he has a more medical science background, and my major was American Studies. I analyze things. I'm a writer. And so I was able to put a lot of that into the volunteer work that I did, and as a coach and so on. And so, and I now have the gift, due to our flexibility as a family, to have participated in different types of jobs that, again, my foundation in regards to leadership, in regards to the kind of network. I don't know how many times throughout my years I've been able to turn to one of my Trinity family members for some sort of resource or help or advice or connection. And that family has helped move us, and they've also been extremely supportive. So now that I'm more mature, I see that my journey was not what society deems as successful. And yet I had the solid education foundation to be able to build what we currently have. My children are now, one is a junior at Temple University. I have my eldest, he's about to graduate from UConn, and my youngest is a junior in high school. And I couldn't be more proud of the types of human being that they are. And to have the kinds of conversations, because I was able to learn and see and continue to learn, hence why I'm still involved at Trinity, that I can then offer not only them, but whenever I go back to Trinity, I'm able to talk to some of the young people. And Terrie, you touched on that earlier in regards to people coming from different backgrounds. And I'm so aware of that, that's one of the things that I am always advising the young people is careful how we judge. We're, in the end, we're coming towards the same thing. And it's a matter of synergy where we each are able to offer something for something a lot stronger.
Oh, I want to echo that point again. One of the things I think that was most important to me, and because I've had the advantage of living in 16 cities and doing a lot of traveling, is coming to understand that you can accept people who are different. But if you all have the same goals, in accepting them and understanding them is all part of it. And you don't even have to like somebody, you just have to accept them. And then you can move forward in that. And when I lived in New York City, I for a good while, and then I moved to Los Angeles. I can't forget sitting in a meeting and people were saying, well, I don't like that person, you know, I don't want to work with them. And I said, one of the things that I learned in New York City was a very simple thing. I don't have to like you to work with you. If our goals are the same, if we have to, or if our goals are different, but we need to work together. So it's a valuable lesson. One, I hope I've passed on to my son, as a matter of fact.
Nice. Thank you, ladies. And so, Terrie, you talked a little bit about, you just listed a few different cities where you lived. You are a museum professional, a museum exec. So you pretty much lived a lot of places. And so for the folks that maybe didn't check out your bio, can you tell them a little bit about what you did as a museum professional and how did that happen? And then talk a little bit about the various places that you lived and explored, because you've been all over the world.
Oh boy, you asked the hard question here. So actually I've lived in 16 cities. I may be in my 17th. And the advantage of that is that you get to be really adaptable. I learned that from having my parents moved a few places with the Army. So you learn that skill. But as a museum professional, you go where the jobs are. You learn to be part of this experience or that experience. I also was able to work across the arts. So I've lived in, and I'm gonna rattle them real quick. I was born in Youngstown, Ohio. I lived in Columbus, Ohio, and Baltimore, which is where I graduated from Forest Park High School. Of course, Hartford, Connecticut. Then I went to Cornell, and so I've had the upstate New York experience. And also spent a summer in Raleigh, North Carolina, working with the United Negro Improvement Association. So that's an entire different story. I went from Cornell to Columbia and lived in New York City, maybe 15 years. At the Studio Museum in Harlem, I was the first senior curator. I also put together the New York Transit Museum. So I know a whole lot about buses and subways, not to mention unions and architectural development. I then went to California and ran the California, what was then Afro-American Museum, and then had one of the best experiences of my life. I worked with the Los Angeles Festival, and we did the festival to help heal Los Angeles after the Rodney King riots. My son was 7 and he still talks about that experience. So, and then from there, I went to Portland, Maine, and someone said, why did you go to Portland, Maine? I ran the Children's Museum of Maine right in downtown Portland. I was also head of the Portland Arts and Culture Alliance, and I also was a Rotarian. And I tell that story because when you live in a place like Maine, you should do what Mainers do. That's how you learn the community. That's how you have an impact. That's how you can make a difference in people's lives. And that's part of what I did in Maine. And then I went to Philadelphia to rebrand what became the Philadelphia African American Museum, get it back on at a certain level. I was engaged in all sorts of activities there, which was quite something. And I also then ended up working for the mayor of Philadelphia, who was interested in redoing a park. And I later went on to be part of the team putting together the revamping of the President's House, which is the President's House project for the National Park Service, where George Washington lived when he had his enslaved servants with him. So it's interesting project. And I traveled back and forth. I lived in Atlanta and worked in Kansas City. I'm not making this up, Taniqua. I did fly back and forth between Atlanta and Kansas City once a week for 2 years. Then I moved to Maryland or to the DC area, and I'm the CEO and founding director of the United States Capitol Visitor Center, which has very much been in the news of late. I went to Saudi Arabia to work on the King Abdul Center for World Culture. And I opened the Center for Civil and Human Rights in Atlanta, Georgia, in any spattering of things. So that kind of gives you an idea of where I've been. And I have to say, what I brought with me everywhere I went was that number one thing: I need to talk to people. I need to listen to them. I need to find out about the environment, go out and explore the environment. And the thing that I most enjoy is the African-American community everywhere is just so interesting. It's always different. The arts community in general is always different. So regionalisms drive what people believe. Regionalisms also drive partly of what they can expect of other people. So it's sort of part of me now. And there's a whole bunch of other places in between there. So, and as somebody has reminded me, I am now living in the greater Harrisburg, Pennsylvania area and being involved in the arts. And I would say I was quasi-retired, but I seem to be being dragged into things. So Taniqua, does that give you kind of a general idea?
Yes, I mean, see, so you lived everywhere, and we're gonna have to do another conversation just about the arts, right? Because this woman has a wealth of knowledge about so many artifacts and cultural hubs across the nation. And I know that we have an alum, I won't put her on the spot, that lives in Saudi Arabia right now, so she's gonna have to make sure she go there and check it out. But also, I think we should take a step back. Like, how did this happen? How did you become a museum professional? During your time at Trinity, I think your major was intercultural studies. So how did that lead you to the museum industry? Did you always know that you wanted to participate in this field? Tell us a little more.
Well, it's a good question. I fell in love with museums because of my parents. When we were in Baltimore, we went down to the Smithsonian in the 60s. And that's when Smithsonian Institute, which is there in Washington, D.C., was becoming much more of an open museum, a much more inviting to the public, is all that beginning of the museum movement, the greater museum movement. So I went down and I just wow, this is very cool. So there I was, I went to Trinity, I went to Cornell, I went to Columbia, and I picked up all of these degrees. And at some point you realize, this is, I'm not gonna be doing this, I'm not gonna be doing that. And I went to a teacher of mine who I'd had at Trinity, who happened to live in New York. She was a writer, and I'm blanking on her name. And I was telling her, I'm really interested in museums, and I was finishing up my degree at Columbia. I had maybe 2 more months before I'd finished that. So that's my master's at Columbia and my School of International Affairs degree. And I had a chance, thanks to her, to go have an interview with Mary Smith Campbell, who was the executive director of the Studio Museum in Harlem, who is now currently the president of Spelman College. So here I was, maybe 20, I don't know, 5 perhaps, maybe 26. And I sat down next to Mary Campbell at the Studio Museum of Harlem. And these days, the Studio Museum was a loft space over a liquor store at 125th Street and Lenox Avenue, which now is affectionately Malcolm X Boulevard. And Mary Campbell looked at me and she said, well, Terrie, what would you do if 125 pieces of art had been left in a basement? And how would you organize it? So I'm not an art historian, but I am a historian. So I simply told her how I would go about organizing this collection of 125 pieces. I got this job. It wasn't a well-paying job, but it was a job. I could pay my rent, and I became the curator of the Harlem State Office Building art collection. And I used to travel around upstate New York with this collection, talking about it. And yes, indeed, I did order it, put it in order. We framed it. We started doing exhibits, but more importantly, I then got to know the Harlem community. I would go and sit and talk with the elected officials whose offices were there. I would go and sit and talk to other icon people there, because it was the community I lived in. And I ultimately moved to an address that some New Yorkers might know, which is 409 Edgecombe Avenue, which is up there on the hill. And I lived in W.E.B. Du Bois's apartment. So suddenly you find yourself immersed in 20th century history of New York City. And I was hooked on museums, and that's what I've done and things around them and developing them for over 40 years.
You are amazing. Amazing. I need to we need a memoir. We need
a memoir.
So if anybody out there in the audience wants to do a movie on Terrie, yes, I definitely watched. A little more of a somber note, in our first event from Breaking the Silence series, Dr. India Lorick-Wilmot explained the difference between mentorship and sponsorship. And so now it's become a prominent part of our conversation. How have you applied these concepts for the betterment of our female BIPOC community?
Well, I'm really glad you asked that question. I believe so deeply in mentorship. I reach out to people, when people are having issues, I want to reach out and say, what can I do to help? I want to be in the room to be the person to say, you need to hire this person and not that person. And I want to advocate for people. But more importantly, I want to be the person that someone calls and says, Terrie, I have an issue. Will you listen to me? Yes, I'll listen to you. That's important to me. Every once in a while I'll go someplace and somebody I've been talking to says, well, this is Terrie, she's one of my mentors. And I'm taken aback a little bit because I'm reminded that I do it sort of, I'm not self-conscious of it so much as it is important to me to be able to be a helping hand, largely because when I was coming through, we didn't have anybody in particular to reach out to. So I think it's important to do that. So mentoring is listening, sponsoring is saying, hey, I have a person for this job. Hey, I have a person who can do that. Those are two things that I strongly believe in and I work at very hard as often as possible.
And I think we have circled around that this evening or I shouldn't say circled, we touched upon it this evening in different ways because it just seems like what we have in common throughout the generation is the sisterhood that has been part of Trinity and that we've taken with us. And because of that, what would you say to your younger self?
Oh man, that's the hardest question yet. I guess what I would say to my younger self is don't be so hard on yourself. I think, like other people, I stressed about things, I worried about things, I would say, don't be so hard on yourself. And, that sort of trite expression, it's going to be all right. It is going to be all right. That's what I would do. I had a professor at Cornell, Roseanne Bell, who died almost 15, 20 years ago. And she was a writer. And I remember talking to her a lot. And that was typically her sentiment. In a sense, she was mentoring me on this notion of don't be so hard on yourself. So I think that's the thing I would say to a younger me. What about you? What would you say to your younger self?
That it's going to be okay to be kind and softer on myself, that perfection doesn't exist, and to enjoy the moments for what they are, because they really are moments. We believe that whatever is happening in our life is the worst thing that is happening or the biggest drama or whatever. And then you soon look back and be like, oh, I can't believe that I thought that was. And so, just being a little bit more loving towards myself and being laughing at the little moments. That would be my advice. Of course, I've got tons of others, but I'm going to keep it simple. How about you, Taniqua?
I think it would be to try new things and take risks. I think at my time at Trinity, I tried to play it safe a lot because I was just scared. This was change in itself, right? So I didn't branch out as much. I mean, I had friends that, weren't in my everyday groups, but just different experiences, such as going to organizations event that's outside of what I normally go to, talk to new people and things of that sort. I think I played it safe at Trinity. And a lot of students play it safe for various reasons, but I think I would have definitely advised myself to take some risks and try new things. And so I guess with that said, I'll ask my next question. And this goes to what Sophie Wadsworth in the chat also said. And so as a student of color, as a young Black girl, you obviously navigated so many nuances of race and gender, especially at the early stages of coeducation at Trinity, right? And you talked about this just a little bit at the beginning. And so Sophie and I, we're curious to learn a little bit more about, your experience growing with your growing identities, given the college's culture, right? So how did you navigate those two identities? One as a Black girl at the time, and then two, one as a Black person, excuse me, and then two as a girl, as a young woman. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Oh man, again, a hard one. As a young Black woman, that was navigating that was often a little odd, because I was real activist personality type. I'm just 5'2", kid, and I was pretty soft spoken. I wasn't, I'm kind of outspoken now, but I was pretty laid back. So trying to navigate that was difficult. I was the RA in Elton on the 3rd floor when half the floor was African-American women, or maybe it was the whole floor. So I was the resident advisor. And sometimes, you would come back and there'd be a little conflict, usually involving some young man, and you would try to go in and try to navigate those moments. So at that moment, you're trying to be big sister and you're like a year older than everybody. And you're also trying to be a girl because somebody's feelings are hurt, because that's what it's about. It's somebody's feelings are hurt. So you're navigating in that. Or, I'm the African-American woman in a class, and there are guys who are not necessarily African-American, who are not particularly excited about you being there, shall we say. And so you're dealing with that and wondering, how do I manage that particular dynamic? So it was always interesting to me. And I also was aware of the fact that because I was an African-American woman and I had relationships with the African-American men, people related to you a little differently, because they're only going to offend you so far, because it's that whole interpersonal issues that are going on. And there's a part of me that says, I should have been my own person sometimes, because defining you is important. So that those walking through that. Now I tell you what I did learn from that is I learned, and I use that as a skill, how to manage that dynamic in the working world on a regular basis. And that is really kind of keeping people at a certain distance and bringing them in when necessary, and not being worried about how people interpreted that. So it taught me that part of that skill. So, but tell me, you're younger than me. How did you learn that skill?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think gender necessarily played a role in some of the barriers or challenges that I had. Race was definitely one. My major was sociology, but my minor was legal studies. And in both of the majors, my sociology major, the professors were amazing. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that they were able to change the hearts and minds of all of our peers, right? So to truly kind of, I think for me, I often found myself speaking up and I can't, as one person in my own personal experience, I can't speak up for the entire Black community, but I found myself often in the classroom speaking up when it came to things such as race and just debunking basic myths, right? And I found that in my legal studies classes a lot. And that's a conversation that we have today. We see it happening every day in the media. Like what does justice look like, right? And so that, I think, race played a big role. And some people may be questioning, well, since Taniqua started the conversation, she's been talking about race, but that's because race has truly shaped my experience at Trinity. And that's pretty much how it's been. And unfortunately, that's the case for many of our Trinity, peers and current students as well, whether it's positive or negative. Like I said, I had a positive time at Trinity. So it was more race than gender, but it was also a lot of learning, right? Not necessarily me teaching people, but learning from one another in a classroom and truly engaging, using the classroom as a place to engage with people that didn't look like me. So that was my experience, and it wasn't anything that was detrimental, luckily for me, not saying that wasn't the case for other people. But it was a classroom. We were learning from one another, and that was the glory of my sociology classes.
Unfortunately, there's only a few minutes left, and we want to make sure that we address the audience, though I think I touched on it, earlier in regards to admitting that there was a lot that I still was learning and navigating. So that was more my experience in a nutshell. But with that, I just want to thank everyone who took the time to sit in on this conversation. And what I hope that many of you received was a little bit of an insight of how diverse, not just the time period, but that our past can be and is, and maybe even think about some other questions that you would want to ask or be part of a conversation. So I'm going to pass it on to Taniqua in regards to the survey, but that might be something that you would want to include in regards to feedback is, what other questions do you wonder? Because that could probably be part of another series, depending on some of the connections that we make. So thank you again, everyone.
Yes. Thank you for joining us. It was a pleasure to be a part of a panel of women that paved the way for me to be at Trinity. That definitely smoothed out, some of the bumps in the road that other girls faced. So it's an honor and a privilege to be on this panel. And this is a great representation of what identity and generations look like, various identity backgrounds and generation looks like. I'm at Trinity, and this is just a small snippet of it, right? There's so many other dynamic people a part of our alumni community that have stories to tell as well. So as Yarel said, please share some questions because that can help us shape a conversation, another interview type or discussion for future panels. So please fill out the post-event survey. I believe Shakira shared it in the chat. And thank you so much for joining us. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Take a look at our bios in the confirmation if you didn't have the chance to do so. You'll find out even more information about Ms. Terrie Rouse-Rosario, and you will see that's just a small snippet of her life. So I'm gonna actually hand this virtual stage over to Ms. Terrie and let her have some closing words.
Oh, good. Thank you. Thank you both. This has been wonderful. It is to think that it has been 50 years since I entered Trinity, and to be able to reach out and talk to young people younger than me about this wonderful experience. It's just been great. So thank you very much. Hopefully this will encourage other people to join the Women's Leadership Committee, and hopefully it'll allow everybody to reflect a little bit on their own experience because it shapes us all. So I hope everybody has a good night. Thank you.